Let me tell you something that makes anyone who's never studied history or got sidetracked listening to a bunch of World War II documentaries deeply uncomfortable. Adolf Hitler was insanely popular, and not at the end, but in the beginning. Packed rallies, roaring applause, young people chanting his name, middle-class families nodding along, business leaders backing him, churches cooperating, newspapers, at first, normalizing him. He didn't seize power as a villain. He campaigned, he promised, he reassured. He said things people wanted to hear. We're going to fix the economy. We're going to restore pride. We're going to make the country great again. We're going to deal with all the chaos. We're going to protect you. And that part often gets skipped in school because it's so much easier to teach monster than it is to teach popular. And here's why that matters. Authoritarianism does not start with jackbooted stormtroopers in the streets. It starts with thunderous applause, and it starts with relief. It starts with someone saying, "I alone can fix it," and a crowd thinking, "Finally." And before anyone's blood pressure spikes, no, I am not saying we are 1930s Germany, even though a lot of the time it does feel that way. And if that's where your brain just sprinted to, please, have a drink of water. But what I am saying is this. History doesn't just rhyme in violence. It rhymes in the vibes, in charisma, in grievance, in the emotional high of someone telling you the problem is not complicated. It's them. And if you've been alive for more than 5 minutes in modern politics, you've heard that song before. It's catchy, it's simple, and it feels real good. And then, once the emotional loyalty is locked in, the rest gets so much easier. Now, here's the part modern strongman fans never want to talk about. You can't skip the make people like you stage of the authoritarian playbook. You don't start with all the insanity. You start with relatability. You don't begin with censorship. You begin with complaining about bias. You don't begin with locking journalists up. You begin with just calling them fake. You don't start with camps. You start with paperwork. That's the rhythm. And here's the wild part. People don't vote for chaos. They vote for comfort. They don't vote for repression. They vote for restoration. They don't vote for destroy democracy. They vote for please make this feel stable again. That's how it works. And if you think, well, I'd never fall for that, Nate, well, then history would like to have a word with you. Because you see, history is full of regular, church-going, hard-working, family-loving people who all thought they were just voting for stability, not catastrophe. You see, they weren't stupid. They were just tired, scared, humiliated. They were told someone could fix it. And he was popular. Very popular. Which brings me to something I've noticed in a lot of modern politics. You can't promise you're going to make everything better, cheaper, safer, stronger, more respected, and then immediately make everything more expensive, less stable, and diplomatically awkward, and still expect people not to notice. Well, I mean, you can, if you convince them the journalists pointing it out are the enemy. You see, that's the trick. Not be perfect, just be believed. And if you can get people to like you first, and I mean really like you, they will excuse what they would have condemned in someone else. And that's not a partisan statement. That's just human psychology. You see, we forgive our team, and we scrutinize the other team. And authoritarians don't build movements on fear alone. They build them on the feeling of belonging. Because you see, belonging feels good, it feels safe, and it feels like clarity. And clarity is addictive when the world feels confusing. So today, we're not starting with camps. We're not starting with the jackbooted stormtroopers. Hell, we're not even starting with censorship. We're starting with something much, much simpler: popularity. Because before truth gets attacked, before journalists get labeled, before reality becomes optional, you have to win the room. And in 1930s Germany, oh, he absolutely did. So let's talk about how that happens and why it matters more than people want to admit. Hey, and welcome to, or welcome back to, the Average Joe Nerdcast. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe, and today we're continuing the History Rhymes series. Part 1 was about narrative control after violence, and Part 2 was about detention and normalization. This part 3, well, this is about truth, about what happens when the press stops being trusted, about what happens when journalism becomes a target, about what happens when entire news ecosystems start acting less like watchdogs and more like megaphones. And before we go any further, let me say something clearly. This episode is not about pretending that the media is perfect, because let's be honest, it's not. Bias absolutely exists. Corporate influence exists. Clickbait exists. Partisan slant absolutely exists. And pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But there is a massive difference between media has bias and the media is the enemy. There's a difference between criticizing journalism and delegitimizing the idea of journalism altogether. And history gets very loud when that line starts blurring. So today, we're talking all about Hitler's war on what he called the lying press, the Nazi propaganda machine and how it replaced journalism with loyalty, the modern use of fake news rhetoric, the psychology of turning reporters into villains, and what happens when entire networks stop asking questions and start protecting power instead. Because authoritarianism doesn't need to ban the press if it can convince you to not trust it. And once trust collapses, then reality becomes optional. Are you ready? Let's get into it. And first, we need to fix something in our collective memory. Because when people think about authoritarian leaders, most everyone imagines immediate repression. And that's just not how it works. Hitler did not start as a dictator in jackboots barking orders into a void. He started as a politician that people liked. And I mean, a lot of people liked him. He was charismatic, he was energetic, he was theatrical, he spoke in absolutes, and he offered clarity in a time of confusion. And Germany in the early 30s was deeply confused. Economic collapse, humiliation after World War I, rampant unemployment, political instability, and violence in the streets. People weren't asking for domination. They were just asking for stability. And he offered it to them. That's the part modern supporters of strongman politics conveniently ignore. The rise doesn't start with repression. It starts with resonance. He spoke to the grievance. He spoke to national pride. He spoke to people who felt embarrassed on the world stage. He didn't begin with, trust no one. He began with, trust only me. And that's the emotional pivot. Because once loyalty becomes emotional, accountability becomes negotiable. Now here's where media enters the story. Before Hitler consolidated power, he attacked the credibility of independent journalism. He used the term Lügenpresse, which literally means lying press. The goal wasn't to shut newspapers down immediately. The goal was to erode trust over time. If people believe journalists are corrupt, biased, elitist, or enemies of the nation, then they stop weighing evidence. And instead, they start weighing loyalty. And here's the key: you don't need to eliminate journalism if you can flood the environment with friendly outlets. Joseph Goebbels didn't just censor, he replaced. He built a propaganda machine that controlled the messaging, simplified the narratives, repeated slogans, and framed dissent as betrayal. And he understood something very powerful. If you say something enough, in enough places, and with enough confidence, people start to feel that it's true. Now, quick pause, because this is where I think we need some nuance. Modern media absolutely has bias. Every single outlet frames stories completely differently. Every network chooses what to emphasize. And some chase outrage because, let's face it, outrage pays. That's real. But bias is not the same thing as propaganda. Bias says, I see the world through this lens. And propaganda says, I will distort the world to protect power. There is a clear difference. And history cares about that difference greatly. You see, when news networks begin operating less like investigators and more like shield bearers for political movements, when correction becomes betrayal, when defending a leader becomes more important than verifying the facts, then you're no longer dealing with journalism. You're dealing with narrative enforcement. And here's where I'll keep it simple. If a news outlet never questions its preferred leader, dismisses inconvenient evidence automatically, frames all criticism as conspiracy, treats every scandal as a hoax, and encourages distrust of every other outlet, then that's not information. That's insulation. And insulation is oxygen for authoritarian systems. Now, light joke moment. You cannot run on I alone can fix it and then have groceries cost more. Your alliances get shakier and global standing wobble and expect no one to check the scoreboard. Unless you've already convinced your entire audience that the scoreboard is fake. That's the move. Not perfection, just perception. Because once the press becomes the villain, then the leader becomes the narrator. And when the narrator controls the story, facts become suggestions. So let's talk about it. Because this is where things get almost funny. And not necessarily, haha, funny. More along the lines of darkly predictable funny. Because once a leader convinces people the media is corrupt, biased, fake, evil, or just out to get him, something incredible happens. Nothing really needs to be proven anymore. You can say, that story is fake, and that's enough. You don't have to show why. You don't even have to disprove it. And you definitely don't have to offer any shred of evidence. You just have to say it with confidence. And if your audience already distrusts journalists more than they distrust you, that's game over, man. Now, here's where we can relax for a quick second, because this move is almost comically simple. Imagine you're in school. You didn't do your homework. The teacher says, "Where is it?" And you respond, "Actually, the teacher is biased." That's it. That's the move. You don't fix the missing homework, but you attack the authority asking you for it. And if you can get the whole class to believe the teacher hates only you, suddenly, you're not irresponsible. You're persecuted. That's not advanced political theory. That's playground psychology. And it works on adults just as well as it works on kids. Now, let's zoom back to 1930s Germany. Independent journalists criticized the Nazi Party. Instead of responding point by point, the party instead said, they're lying, they're corrupt, they're controlled by enemies of Germany, they're trying to weaken the nation. And over time, that repeated message did something very powerful. It made people emotionally suspicious of information before they even heard it. And that's the goal. Not censorship first, suspicion first, because suspicion is quieter. Suspicion spreads socially. Suspicion doesn't require laws. And once suspicion becomes the default setting, then you don't need to shut newspapers down immediately, because people stop trusting them voluntarily. So let's bring this forward. Modern leaders don't have to ban journalism in dramatic fashion. They just have to say fake news enough times that the phrase replaces critical thinking. And here's the wild part. Sometimes the media does mess up. Sometimes, yes, there is bias. And sometimes headlines are completely irresponsible. And that's exactly what makes the tactic so effective. Because if you can point to just one mistake and say, see, they're all corrupt, then you've flattened nuance. It's almost like saying, this one restaurant messed up my order, therefore food is a conspiracy. It's absurd when you really slow it down. But emotionally, it feels really satisfying. And that's the key word, satisfying. Authoritarian rhetoric doesn't have to be accurate. It just has to be emotionally rewarding. Now, here's where we add just a little pressure. There's a massive difference between saying the media has bias and saying the media is the enemy. One invites reform, while the other invites eradication. And once the phrase enemy of the people enters the conversation, history perks up, because that phrase is not modern. It's not accidental. It's a classic power move. You're not just criticizing journalism anymore. You're reframing journalists as adversaries of the nation itself. Now, quick pause, because this is important. If you can convince people that reporters are enemies, then covering protests becomes suspicious. Investigating corruption becomes sabotage. Asking hard questions becomes treason adjacent. And when journalists start getting arrested while covering events, when they get labeled masterminds instead of observers, that's not about public safety. That's about discomfort with visibility. And if a network, and I mean any network, exists primarily to shield a leader instead of scrutinize one, then that's not journalism. That's narrative maintenance. And again, I'm not naming names. You don't really need me to. If a network popped into your head during that description, you're not imagining things. But here's where we're going to tighten it back up. The Nazi propaganda machine didn't just attack independent outlets. It built its own ecosystem. Radio, newspapers, posters, rallies, film. And the genius, and yes, it was a form of genius, was the repetition. Simple slogans repeated constantly, emotionally charged, easy to remember, easy to chant. When a population hears the same framing over and over and over, it doesn't feel like persuasion. It just feels like reality. And here's the thing people don't want to admit. We are all susceptible to repetition. You, me, everyone. The human brain equates familiarity with truth. If you hear something enough times, it feels correct, even if you never take the time to examine it. And that's not stupidity. That's just wiring. So when modern politics leans into the media is corrupt, you can't trust anyone else. Only we tell it like it is. Everything negative about me is a hoax. That's not random bluster. That's conditioning. And it only works after popularity is secured. Because here's the part modern authoritarian fans just skip over. You can't run on, I'm going to make everything better, and then have things become more expensive, less stable, and diplomatically chaotic, and expect no one to notice, unless they've already been trained not to trust the people pointing it out. That's the insulation. That's the shield. That's the ecosystem. It's not about eliminating criticism. It's about discrediting critics so thoroughly that criticism feels partisan by default. And once that happens, truth becomes team-based. And when truth becomes team-based, power becomes incredibly hard to dislodge. So now we need to zoom out again for a second, because this isn't about one country, and it isn't just about one leader. It is about a pattern, though. Popularity first, narrative control second, institutional distrust third, consolidation after that. And the step we're sitting in right now, the trust collapse. When you can't tell who's credible, when every source is suspect, when every fact has a counterfact, people don't become more informed. They start becoming exhausted. And exhausted people choose simplicity. Strong voice, clear enemy, easy story. That's the cycle. And this is why the war on journalism isn't petty. It isn't cosmetic. It's foundational. Because once the referee is discredited, the game gets rewritten entirely. And the crowd keeps cheering. And this is where things stop being theoretical. Because once journalism is successfully reframed as biased, corrupt, elitist, or fake, the next step isn't persuasion anymore. It's punishment. And it's often bureaucratic. Journalists don't usually get rounded up overnight. First, they get mocked. Then they're labeled. Then they get delegitimized. Then they get blamed. And slowly, they get treated as participants instead of observers. And that shift matters more than people realize. Because in a functioning democracy, journalists are supposed to be outside the story. They just report it. They question it. Then they document it. They are not the villains in it. But once a leader convinces enough people that the press is hostile to the nation, that boundary collapses. And when that boundary collapses, covering a protest becomes incitement of one. Investigating corruption becomes harassment. Filming law enforcement becomes interference. You don't need to ban the press if you can reclassify them. And that's the move. Now, think about how subtle that is. No headline that says freedom of the press is suspended. Instead, reporters detained for protesting. Charges filed pending investigation. Access restricted for security reasons. Credentials revoked due to protocol violations. Administrative language. Clean, professional, technically defensible. And every single step can be framed as reasonable in isolation. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because once journalists begin facing legal pressure simply for being present, something important is shifting. Other reporters start thinking twice. Editors get very cautious. Networks start to pull back. And freelancers weigh risk versus exposure. You don't silence the press by force. You make the job more expensive, legally, financially, psychologically. And here's where history rhymes again. In Nazi Germany, independent journalists were first attacked rhetorically. Then they were pushed out of positions. Then papers were consolidated. Then dissenting voices were replaced with loyal ones. The press didn't disappear overnight. It was squeezed. And that squeeze is the tell. Now, let's connect this to something even more modern. Authoritarian systems don't just attack journalists. They create alternative realities. And this is where propaganda evolves. Because early 20th century propaganda required heavy state control. But modern propaganda, it just needs volume. You don't eliminate competing information. You drown it out. You flood the space with counterclaims, emotional reactions, distractions, conspiracies, and outrage cycles. Truth becomes one voice in a stadium of noise, and human brains are not built to parse infinite noise. We simplify. We retreat to trusted voices. We retreat to our team. We retreat to whoever sounds the most confident. And that's not necessarily weakness, that's just cognitive survival. But it's exploitable. And here's the trick modern propaganda has mastered. You don't need everyone to believe your version. You just need enough people to doubt every other version. And once doubt is universal, accountability stalls. If every fact has a counterfact, if every video is out of context, if every investigation is politically motivated, people don't become more skeptical. They become tired. And tired people don't fact check. They just vibe check. Who feels strong? Who feels certain? Who feels like they're winning? That becomes the metric. And this is where media ecosystems become powerful. If an outlet, any outlet, operates less like a question asker and more like a shield, less like a watchdog and more like a bodyguard, it becomes part of the propaganda environment whether it intends to or not. Because propaganda isn't always lies. Sometimes it's just omission. Sometimes it's selective framing. Sometimes it's repetition of emotionally charged language. Sometimes it's refusing to correct because correction would hurt their team. And here's the important distinction. Propaganda doesn't require everyone to lie. It just requires enough people to prioritize loyalty over verification. And that's it. Once loyalty outranks the truth, the system begins to tilt. And here's where the humor fades away. Because once journalists are seen as the enemy, and once the information environment is flooded, and once the truth begins to collapse, the public can't tell when something real is happening. And that's the moment power becomes comfortable. Because outrage no longer has traction. Evidence no longer moves the needle. Facts become partisan. And when facts become partisan, leaders stop fearing exposure. That's when consolidation becomes possible. And I'm going to talk about that next. Because once truth is destabilized, power doesn't need to hide anymore. It just needs to endure. Okay, deep breath. Because I can feel some of you right now like, Nate, buddy, you're throwing a lot at me, and this is getting heavy really fast. I know. So let's zoom out for just a quick second. Imagine trying to explain modern propaganda to your great-grandparents. Yeah, so basically, instead of one guy in a uniform yelling into a radio about how glorious everything is, we now have 400 podcasts, 12 cable networks, 8 million YouTube channels, 3 anonymous accounts with eagle profile pictures, and your uncle sharing memes at 6 o'clock in the morning before anyone's even had coffee. That's the upgrade. We didn't replace propaganda. We democratized it. Congrats, everybody! We invented the world's first crowdsourced confusion machine. You don't need a ministry of truth when you've got breaking, you won't believe this, a thumbnail with someone screaming, and a comment section that looks like it's one bad Wi-Fi connection away from civil war. Modern propaganda doesn't goose step. It just clickbaits. And that is very important because it just feels casual. It feels optional, and it feels like entertainment. It doesn't feel like state messaging. It just feels like vibes. And vibes are a very slippery slope. You can argue facts. You can argue policy. But you cannot argue vibes. If someone feels like the press is corrupt, no amount of documentation will fix that. If someone feels like journalists are enemies, evidence won't penetrate that feeling. Because propaganda today isn't built on information. It's all built on emotion. Fear, belonging, humiliation, resentment, and pride. It's less, here are the facts, and more, here's how you're supposed to feel about the facts. And once emotion outranks evidence, facts become optional. Now, here's the funny part, and I promise this is the last joke before we tighten it back up. Authoritarian propaganda used to require incredible coordination, but today, all it really needs is a trending tab and a bored population. You don't have to silence dissent. You just have to drown it in celebrity scandals, culture war bullshit, 15 simultaneous outrages, and one manufactured crisis per week. It's almost like intellectual whiplash. Nobody can focus long enough to finish a thought, which, coincidentally, is perfect if you're trying to avoid accountability. Okay, quick breath over, because here's the problem. When journalism is targeted and information is flooded, and truth becomes emotional instead of verifiable, the next move is almost inevitable. Power doesn't just want to survive scrutiny. It wants to stop fearing it, and that's where consolidation comes in. So, it's time to tighten it back up, because this is when power stops defending itself, and it starts hardening itself. And that's the shift most people miss, because it doesn't look dramatic at first. It just looks procedural. New rules, new norms, new efficiency measures, new justifications for why oversight is inconvenient. And it's always framed as practicality. Government works better when it's streamlined. Too much red tape. Too many checks slow us down. We need decisive leadership. And if you've been paying attention in the last 2 episodes, that language should feel very familiar. Because consolidation of power never shows up yelling, "I demand total control." It shows up saying, "This would just work better if fewer people were in the way." And here's the thing. Democracy is slow on purpose. Checks and balances are inefficient on purpose. Independent courts are frustrating on purpose. A free press is annoying on purpose. All of that friction you see, it's not a bug. It's the safety mechanism. Authoritarian movements don't see friction as safety. They see it as sabotage. So the next move after discrediting journalism is simple. Reduce the number of people who can say no. And you do that by attacking courts, delegitimizing elections, replacing career professionals with loyalists, redefining civil servants as deep state actors, and expanding executive authority in the name of a crisis. And none of that requires jackbooted thugs. It just requires paperwork. That's the boring part nobody makes movies about, but it's the part that matters the most. Because once institutions are hollowed out, they still look the same from the outside. The building, it's still there. The flag, it's still flying. The press conference is still happening. But inside, the guardrails are gone completely. And here's where we need to be very honest about something uncomfortable. Popularity is often the gateway drug. Authoritarian leaders are rarely unpopular in the beginning. They're charismatic, they're blunt, they say what people are already thinking but were afraid to say out loud. They promise simplicity in a complicated world. Hitler was wildly popular in the early years. And that's not revisionist history. That's documented fact. He was seen as someone restoring pride, restoring order, and restoring economic stability. The people loved him. That's the part modern authoritarians quietly forget to mention. You don't consolidate power by announcing the insanity. You consolidate power by delivering emotional relief first. You make the people feel heard, and you make them feel powerful. You make them feel like someone finally has their backs. Then you start adjusting the rules. And here's where the joke lands perfectly. You can't run on, "I'm going to make everything better, cheaper, safer, stronger," and then immediately make everything more expensive, less stable, more chaotic, and internationally embarrassing. You can't promise economic revival and then set fire to global trade relationships like you're speedrunning diplomatic isolation. That's not strategy. That's someone who skipped the reading assignment. Authoritarian consolidation depends on sustained approval. If the material conditions get worse fast enough, the illusion begins to crack. And when the illusion cracks, there are only two options left: fix the conditions or control the narrative even harder. History suggests which path usually gets chosen because it's easier to blame journalists, the immigrants, the protesters, or globalists than it is to just admit policy failure. And that's the pivot. When popularity starts to wobble, scapegoats get louder. The rhetoric sharpens, the enemies list grows, the definition of threat expands. And suddenly the consolidation isn't about efficiency anymore. It's just about survival. And that's the danger zone. Because once power believes it must survive at all costs, every guardrail becomes optional. And we're not there yet. But if you understand the sequence, discredit journalism, flood information, erode trust, expand authority, blame dissent, then you start to see the architecture. And architecture is built long before the storm arrives. We're not predicting the storm. We're pointing at the scaffolding. Now the question becomes, what interrupts consolidation before it calcifies? And that's where I'm heading to next. Because once power is concentrated, the fork in the road gets very, very real. And once consolidation begins, the most important question is no longer how did we get here? It's what stops this? And to tell you the truth, the uncomfortable answer is nothing automatic. You see, democracy does not self-heal. It requires interruption. Authoritarian drift doesn't explode overnight. It calcifies, it hardens, it becomes normalized. And normalization is incredibly quiet. It looks like fewer press briefings, more executive orders, agencies restructured, oversight dismissed as obstruction, watchdogs labeled partisan, dissent framed as disloyalty. And each move is small enough to defend. Each move is justifiable in isolation. That's how consolidation survives scrutiny. It doesn't leap, it just accumulates. Now, here's where we bring this back to journalism, because this entire arc connects. Once the press is discredited, then who calls out the accumulation? Once courts are attacked as biased, then who slows down unlawful policy? Once civil servants are replaced with loyalists, who says no inside the machine? When the guardrails are weakened simultaneously, the system, it still runs. It just runs without any friction. And friction is what prevents free fall. This is why targeting journalism is never about hurt feelings. It's all about removing friction. This is why overwhelming information isn't chaos, it's insulation. And this is why popularity matters early on. Because consolidation without support creates resistance. Consolidation with applause, that's smooth. Now, here's the part we need to say carefully and clearly. Authoritarian leaders are often skilled at one thing above all: narrative control. Not policy depth, not economic nuance, not long-term strategy. Narrative. They simplify, they personalize, they dramatize. You are under attack. I alone can fix it. The system is corrupt. The media lies. The elites betrayed you. It's emotionally efficient. And emotionally efficient messaging spreads faster than policy briefings ever will. Now, layer that onto a fragmented media ecosystem, cable networks that function more like partisan branding, influencers monetizing outrage, algorithms rewarding fear, commentary replacing reporting, and suddenly propaganda doesn't need a central office. It needs amplification. That's the modern power. Not censorship by deletion, censorship by dilution. You don't silence the truth, you just bury it. And once truth is buried, consolidation becomes easier because confused citizens do not mobilize. They disengage. And disengagement is the oxygen of consolidation. Now, here's where I bring this back to you, and I mean you listening right now. The fork in the road doesn't appear when everything is obviously broken. It appears when everything still feels arguable, when people are still debating semantics, when some policies seem defensible, when intentions can still be spun as misunderstood. That's the fork. History does not ask, did you act when it was undeniable? It instead asks, did you act when it was debatable? Because once it's undeniable, then it's usually too late. Now, here's the grounding part. We are not living in 1930s Germany. We are not living in a completed authoritarian state. We are living in a moment of stress, and stress tests systems. The question isn't whether America is doomed. The question is whether Americans understand the pattern well enough to interrupt it. Because patterns do not require panic. They require awareness. And awareness leads to pressure. Pressure leads to accountability. Accountability interrupts consolidation. That's the chain reaction. Not outrage, not chaos, not collapse. Attention. That's the tool. Which brings me to where this episode lands. Journalism becomes a target. Information becomes noise. Power seeks consolidation. Popularity lubricates it. Distraction protects it. That's the rhyme. And if you recognize it early, then you don't have to scream. You just have to refuse the drift. Because consolidation only succeeds when people assume someone else will handle it. In history, it is very clear about that. The people who preserve systems are rarely the loudest. They're the ones who stayed engaged long after the trend cycle moved on. So, here's the uncomfortable but empowering truth. The fork in the road isn't theoretical. It's ongoing. And where it leads, well, that part isn't written yet. Okay, before anybody starts doom scrolling internally and building a bunker in their imagination, let me inject just a little bit of oxygen back into the room. A lot of modern politicians, they are wildly unpopular. And I mean across the fucking board. Left, right, center, upside down. Approval ratings are basically participation trophies at this point in the game. You don't consolidate power easily when half the country thinks you're incompetent and the other half thinks you're fucking embarrassing. And that matters. In early authoritarian movements, popularity was a rocket booster. Hitler wasn't scraping by on meme support. He wasn't trending ironically. He had very real, sustained, enthusiastic buy-in, mass rallies, genuine devotion, broad public belief that he was restoring national pride. That's not what modern Western politics looks like. Modern politics looks like distrust, ridicule, memification, constant public skepticism. And here's the irony. Cynicism, while exhausting, is actually a protective barrier. You can't easily build a cult of personality in an era where your critics have Wi-Fi and Photoshop. Now, that doesn't mean we're safe, but it does mean we're not sleepwalking in adoration. There's a difference between polarization and unified devotion. Authoritarian consolidation thrives on unified devotion. What we have is fragmentation, loud, messy, chaotic, and exhausting. But messy democracies are harder to quietly reshape than adoring ones. That's calming, right? Also, another helpful note, institutional resistance still exists. Courts are still blocking things. Journalists are still doing their jobs and publishing. Whistleblowers are still speaking out. And elections, hopefully, will continue to happen. Public backlash is still forming. Authoritarian drift requires institutional surrender. And what we're seeing is institutional conflict instead. That's friction. And friction, my friends, is healthy. Remember earlier when I said democracy is slow on purpose? That slowness is showing up right now. It's ugly, it's loud, it's incredibly frustrating, but it's not silent because silence is the real danger, and we are not silent. Now, here's the most hopeful part, and this is very, very important. Awareness spreads faster now than at any point in human history. In the 1930s, information bottlenecked, but nowadays, narratives are challenged in real time. Fact checks exist. Independent media exists. Citizen journalism exists. International scrutiny exists. You can't fully monopolize reality anymore. Sure, you can muddy it, you can polarize it, you can distort it, but you cannot own it outright. And that matters. So, as we move into the consolidation of power in the next part of this episode, we're not doing it with panic. We're just doing it with context. The pattern, yes, it exists, but so do counterweights. And here's the real calming thought. Authoritarian projects require momentum. They require escalating success after escalating success, escalating popularity, escalating narrative control. If material conditions get worse, if promises fail, if ridicule outweighs reverence, the momentum stalls. And stalled momentum exposes overreach, which is why some modern authoritarian-leaning movements look incredibly clumsy. They skipped the entire make life materially better chapter and jumped straight to control the narrative harder. That's not a stable foundation. That's improvisation, and improvisation under scrutiny rarely ages well. So yes, my friends, we stay alert, but we don't catastrophize. History rhymes. It does not photocopy, and we are not living in a carbon copy. We are living in a stress test, and stress tests reveal weaknesses in both systems and leaders. That's hopeful. Now, with that grounded perspective, let's move into the next part. Consolidation of power without hysteria, without exaggeration, just clear-eyed pattern recognition. Consolidation of power is not a dramatic crescendo. It's a slow narrowing. And the narrowing is subtle enough that most people don't feel it until it's already taken shape. Here's what consolidation actually looks like in modern systems. Not jackbooted thugs on the streets. Not a constitution ripped up on live television. It just looks like influence. Influence over the courts. Influence over agencies. Influence over regulatory bodies. Influence over election mechanisms. Influence over who enforces and who looks the other way. You see, it's less about grabbing power, and it's more about redirecting it. And here's the critical thing to understand. Authoritarian consolidation in the 21st century doesn't require abolishing democracy. It requires hollowing it out. Keep the elections, keep the courts, keep the press briefings. Just weaken their independence. You don't remove the steering wheel. You disconnect it. Now, let's connect that to the sequence we've been building. First, journalism becomes suspect. Second, information becomes chaotic. Third, trust erodes. Fourth, authority expands in the name of stability. Now you have a public that is confused, polarized, exhausted, and distrustful of watchdogs. That's the environment where consolidation slides through quietly, because when people don't trust institutions, they stop defending them. And that's the paradox. Populist movements often rise on distrust of institutions, but once in power, they require those same institutions to function properly. So instead of reforming them, they reshape them, and reshaping is easier than dismantling. It kind of looks like appointing loyalists instead of career professionals, testing the limits of executive power repeatedly, pushing legal boundaries and daring courts to react, reframing oversight as partisan sabotage, redefining corruption as disagreement. It's pressure applied from multiple angles, not one big move, 1,000 very small ones. Now, here's where the hopeful grounding we talked about truly matters. Consolidation only succeeds fully when resistance collapses. And right now, resistance has not collapsed. It's loud, it's messy, it's divided, but it still exists. The courts are pushing back, states are pushing back, journalists are pushing back, civil society is pushing back. That friction slows consolidation, and slowing matters because authoritarian projects are momentum driven. They require speed because speed creates inevitability. Slow them down, and inevitability evaporates. So let's address something head on. Modern leaders who flirt with authoritarian tactics are often popular with their base, but they are deeply unpopular with everyone else. That is not the same as early 1930s Germany. That was broad consolidation of admiration. What we're seeing now is fractured loyalty. And fractured loyalty makes total consolidation incredibly difficult. Sure, you can centralize power, you can test boundaries, and you can stress institutions. But sustaining total control in a hyper-connected, hyper-critical, hyper-meme society, that's a different beast entirely. You can't rule unchallenged when every speech becomes a remix within 10 minutes. Now, here's the caution. Unpopularity alone doesn't stop consolidation. Plenty of leaders have expanded power while being polarizing. What stops it is structural pushback, legal challenges, institutional refusal, public engagement, electoral consequences. And that's the real fork in the road. And this is where the History Rhymes series is heading. Because consolidation creates a moment, a tipping point. Either institutions hold or they bend. Either citizens re-engage or they disengage. Either scrutiny intensifies or fatigue wins out. History does not decide that. We the people do. And this is why this episode isn't alarmism. It's just maintenance. It's saying pay attention to guardrails. Pay attention to independence. Pay attention to who is being sidelined. Pay attention to whether accountability is strengthening or shrinking. Consolidation thrives in boredom. It thrives in the fatigue. It thrives when people say, I'm tired of giving a shit. So please don't burn out. Do not spiral. Stay present. Because authoritarian drift is not a cliff. It's a slope. And slopes can be walked back up. Now, next up in this episode, the fork in the road. The moment where we zoom out and ask, given everything that we have walked through today, journalism, propaganda, normalization, consolidation, where does this go? And what actually changes the direction? Forks are quiet. They don't announce themselves with sirens. They don't show up when everything still feels arguable. Here's the truth. History doesn't move in straight lines. It oscillates. It tightens. It loosens. It tests systems. It reveals their strength. And right now, we're in a tightening moment. Journalism is under pressure. Information is incredibly chaotic. Trust is fractured. Detention systems are expanding. Power is testing its boundaries. That is one path. But the other path? Pushback, institutional friction, public engagement, course correction. And the thing about forks is this. They are not decided by leaders alone. They are decided by response. If consolidation continues without resistance, it hardens. If it meets scrutiny, it slows. If it meets fatigue, it spreads. If it meets engagement, it recalibrates. That's the whole story. Not destiny, not doom. Feedback. So let's zoom all the way out. Part 1 of History Rhymes was about how violence gets justified. Part 2 was about how detention gets normalized. And this episode was about how journalism gets targeted and truth gets drowned. and about how power consolidates when those guardrails begin to weaken. And this is the moment where all of that either compounds or gets interrupted. But here's the hopeful truth. Modern democracies are not fragile glass. They're stress-tested machines. Yes, they are messy, noisy, and slow, but resilient when people stay engaged. Authoritarian systems require obedience. Democratic systems require participation. That is the clear difference. You don't defend democracy with devotion to a person. You defend it with devotion to the process. Courts, elections, journalism, oversight, transparency. None of those are sexy, but all of them are essential. And here's the real calming perspective. Modern authoritarians are often impatient. They want fast results, fast loyalty, fast dominance. But systems that were built to resist speed are hard to bulldoze quickly. That's why consolidation attempts look so clumsy sometimes, because the friction still exists. And friction, my friends, is hope. Now, let's be honest. We are very polarized. We are fatigued, and we are overwhelmed. But we are not unified in blind devotion. We are not cut off from information. We are not living in a single-channel propaganda ecosystem. And that matters a lot. History rhymes, but it also adapts. And so do we. The fork is not a dramatic moment in the future. It's every single day. It's, do we let euphemisms slide? Do we let the fatigue win? Do we disengage because it's uncomfortable? Or do we stay aware without becoming hysterical? Because awareness, my friends, without hysteria is incredibly powerful. It's steady. It doesn't burn out. It sustains. And that's the real lesson of this entire episode. History doesn't demand perfection. It just demands interruption. It demands that when patterns emerge, someone is willing to say, I recognize those patterns. Not in panic, but in clarity. Now, here's the final grounding thought. We are not living in 1930s Germany. We are living in a complex, modern, hyper-visible world. The same tools that spread propaganda also expose it. The same internet that amplifies lies also documents abuse. The same polarization that fuels division also fuels the resistance. Nothing is inevitable. Not decline, not collapse, not consolidation. The rhyme, it is there. But the ending, it's still unwritten. And that's the part people forget. History is not a prophecy. It's a warning system. And warnings only matter if people pay attention before the alarm becomes background noise. That's the fork. Not fear, not certainty, but choice. And that choice happens long before headlines declare it. So please, stay alert, stay skeptical, and above all, stay human. And don't outsource your responsibility to history, because history is not watching, but the people are, and we're the ones holding the pen. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously. This was not a light episode. This had a lot of weight to it. And if you stayed all the way through it, that means something. Because the easiest thing in the world right now is disengagement. Scroll, laugh, argue, move on. Paying attention is so much harder. And this episode, and the two that came before it, was not about saying that we're doomed. It wasn't about saying history is repeating. It was just about recognizing patterns before they harden. Journalism being labeled as fake, propaganda flooding the zone, truth becoming partisan, power testing guardrails, institution under stress. Those aren't endings. They're just warning signs. And warning signs only matter if someone looks at them. You do not have to agree with every word that I said today, but I hope you felt the intention behind them. This isn't left versus right to me anymore. It's just human versus dehumanization. It's truth versus convenience. It's accountability versus comfort. And I don't plan on being quiet about it. If this episode challenged you, good. If it made you just a little uncomfortable, hey, that's okay. If it made you think, that's the goal. Use it to ask better questions. Use it to stay engaged. And use it to refuse the drift. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, follow the show, please. And if you can, leave a rating if you feel like it. That little 5-star click does more than people realize. And if you want to have these conversations without it turning into cable news chaos, then please come hang out with us in the Average Joe private Facebook group. That's where we talk, we hang out, we play a lot of fun games. I'll post the link to the group in the show notes, or you can head straight over to Facebook and in the search bar, just type in Average Joe Nerdcast, the lobby, and you will find the page. The lobby's always open. Huge shout out to my player 2 for keeping me grounded when I start sounding like I'm prepping for a Senate hearing. And shout out to everyone behind the scenes who sanity check me every chance they get. You know who you are. And shout out to all of you for staying, for listening, and for not checking out. This has been History Rhymes Part 3. As always, stay gold, nerd bold, stay sharp, stay human, stay engaged, and please, don't let the rhyme finish itself. I'll catch you on the next one.
Game over.
And before I can even close this thing out fully, there's one more thing I gotta say. This episode drops on a very, very special day, and I've gotta say something important. Happy birthday to my player 2. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for always grounding me when I start spiraling into research mode, for always listening to my half-formed rants no matter what time of day they come, and for always reminding me that the point of all of this isn't just to be loud, it's to always remain human. You've been with me through every evolution of this show, from the early, is anyone even listening days to right now, and you've never once told me to quiet down when something mattered. You've just made sure I always said it the right way. I love you. I'm so grateful for you. And I hope your special day is lighter than this episode. Happy birthday. Oh, and before I really get out of here, you know me, I've always got one last thing to say. Independent journalism is not left. It isn't right. It isn't red. It isn't blue. It's just accountability. Facts, they don't lean. Evidence does not vote. Documentation doesn't care who you support. And when independent reporters document something uncomfortable, the proper response isn't to attack the source. It's to examine the claim. Because once truth becomes partisan, reality becomes negotiable. And when reality becomes negotiable, power always becomes flexible. Independent reporting is messy. It's imperfect, and it gets things wrong sometimes. But the alternative is never cleaner. The alternative is always narrative control. And history is very, very clear about what happens when narrative control replaces scrutiny. So please, support independent journalists. Read widely. Verify claims that you encounter, and always challenge sources, even the ones that seem like they're on your side. not because it helps one side or the other win, but because it helps the truth survive. And truth surviving is not a political act. It's a civic one. All right, now I'm off my soapbox. I'll see you down the road.